This week, I'm throwing some bud vases according to the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio. But first, at long last, all the packages from my previous online shop restock have been collected and will start their journeys to you. So thank you to everybody who placed an order. What this means though is that my shelves and studio are now empty. Relatively. So I can begin making again. And at this point, in the afternoon, I had about an hour to kill, so I thought I'd throw a board of pots, beginning with a series of bud vases, scaling up in size, made according to the Fibonacci sequence, which is something we were taught to do in Ireland when making groups of pots. We'd measure clay out in ratios that follow this sequence, each number being a combination of the two previous ones. This creates good progression visually, and in this case, I'll be throwing them from £1, £2, £3, £5, and then I looped back around to make a smaller one, to create a group of 5 pots altogether, with a really fluid and natural progression in size between all of them. First though, I'm preparing some stoneware to throw with. This is relatively firm clay, which for these bud vase shapes really helps, as they're made with a top section that overhangs quite dramatically, and if the clay used is too soft, this overhang has the tendency to just collapse inward. It's been a while since I've sat at the wheel and thrown, so excuse me for the rusty throwing you're likely going to see. It always feels a bit strange getting back into it after a month away. These are the tools I'll be using, and from left to right there's my wire, which I use for cutting the pot off the wheel. Then there's a sponge on a stick for removing the excess water inside the pot, a smaller sponge which I use for pulling up the walls, a chamois leather for softening the rim, a sharp potter's needle for popping any bubbles and for levelling the rim if it needs it. Then there's an old, blunted turning tool, which I use to remove excess clay from around the base, and then there's 3 metal kidneys for scraping slip off the walls of the pot and for refining their shape. The first 3 I'll be making will be thrown from £1, £2 and £3 of clay, which is 454 grams, 907 grams, and 1,360 grams. Ultimately, it's the ratio that's important, and this could be scaled up to £5, £10, £15, and so on. And the best thing about throwing like this is it's a brilliant exercise for teaching you how to properly see, as each one of these pots has to look more or less identical, but it's scaled either up or down, and it's all about getting the proportions right. The heights and widths have to be more or less the same between them proportionally, as does the opening at the top. This also means that you have to get the most out of your clay, and if you aren't a particularly confident thrower, this can be a challenge, as when you look at all of the pots after they've been thrown, any outliers will really stand out. All of this will make much more sense the further we get into this video. But the subject of being able to properly see and replicate is an important one, and fundamentally it's something that's gated behind one's technical ability. As when you're first starting to learn how to throw pots, you might have a vision in your mind of the objects you want to create, but due to a lack of skill and practice, you simply cannot make them. And that's entirely normal. That happened to me when I first started to learn how to make pottery. Then, as you get better and more practiced, you can accurately begin to make the pots you envisage, rather than struggling to get there with each piece, and nothing quite resembling what you had in mind. And sitting down and forcing yourself to scale pots up and down in size like this can be an incredible way of increasing your skill. At the same time, it's why replicating other people's work is so important at those early stages, as it teaches you to really see the objects you're creating. In college, when I was learning to make pottery, on a Monday we'd be given a particular shape thrown by one of our tutors, and then as the week progressed, we'd spend day after day trying to replicate it to the very best of our abilities. And it really is surprising how sometimes when you're in this beginning stage, how you simply can't see the differences between your piece and the other. And it can take somebody sitting you down and showing you the differences, pointing them out, making them glaringly obvious. And with time and practice, you can begin to look at shapes and replicate them perfectly. But it takes persistence and a willingness to learn. And at the end of the day, if you are learning how to throw pots, your skill should be something you're trying to improve the entire time. As the more fluent you become at making, the better you'll be able to create the objects that you're intending to make, the pots that are in your mind's eye. Anyway, beyond that, the Fibonacci sequence will mean that these pots have a lovely scale to them as they progress and get taller. And here's that overhang I was speaking about earlier. And as you can imagine, if this was thrown with very soft clay, the inward sloping section could very easily just continue to sag down. So hard clay really helps, even if it does make centering a bit more troublesome. It also means the pots can be lifted off the wheel without distorting at all. Next is the vase made from 2 pounds of clay, and I'm going to be copying the previous shape to the best of my abilities, proportionally, of course. As for this one, the opening at the top will have to be slightly bigger. When making these bud vase shapes, I also make sure to cone the clay up and down numerous times, as it makes it more plastic, more responsive and a bit easier to throw with, which is something I don't always do. Say if I'm making very simple mugs or bowls. Those are shapes where I don't mind if there's a slight touch of movement in the lip, but with these vases and their overhanging rims, I want there to be as little movement in the walls of clay as possible, as any undulations on the shoulder of the pot or on the rim of the opening can really throw everything off. Recently, I've been using these throwing sponges by Mud Tools much more, especially for the first 2 pulls. It helps to keep everything really hydrated, as it's soaked with water that can be squeezed out as I gradually lift the wall up. Additionally, as I tend to wrap it around a single finger, it sort of pads that digit out, meaning my point of contact that I'm lifting with is larger, which, when working with larger lumps of clay, can be very helpful. With the height approximately there, I position a metal kidney on the outside and push the clay out against it from the inside. My aim with these bud vases is to initially throw a cylinder that's a bit taller than necessary. Then, at a certain point, I'll scrape away a majority of the slip from the outside, save the top 2 or 3 centimeters, and it's this portion that I'll collar in and throw into the narrow opening of the vase. It's also, for that reason, why I leave the top portion of the wall relatively thick, as if I were to throw it to be razor sharp at this point, I simply wouldn't have any material left to throw into that overhanging section. Also, if it is very thin, it lacks strength, and that inward sloping section would have a hard time supporting itself. So in a way, I don't mind if the clay at the top is left thicker at this stage, even when it's folded in, as once the pot is turned leather hard, I'll simply be able to trim away any excess weight. Which is the way I generally prefer to work, if it means I can throw it more quickly without having to fuss around with a part of the wall that's very thin and precarious and likely to collapse. So that's the second one, and as you can see at the top, the size of the opening compared to the section that slopes in is proportionally the same on both of them. And it's probably that feature alone that will make these match the most, if I get them right. The same thing can apply to mugs if you're trying to make them all the same, but the thickness of the rim on each of them is different. They simply won't match, or they won't feel right, even if the height and the width is the same. The strength of their strongest features needs to remain the same from piece to piece. This is the 3 pound vase, which is centered and then opened up, and I'm making a base which is about 4 millimeters thick, which I then stretch out by pulling my fingers towards myself. I'll keep pushing down and compressing the bottom, making it flat until it's the thickness I desire. And after this has been set, I won't push down on the base at all, as there simply isn't enough material in it to go any finer, and I don't want to end up with any thin spots, as the wire itself, when it's dragged underneath the pot to separate it from the wheel head, will itself remove about 1 millimeter of clay from the thickness of the base, which means the bases of your pots need to be thick enough to account for this. And if, when you're cutting your pot off the wheel, you can see the wire distort the thin bottom of the pot you're making, then there's a good chance it's either too thin or just on the thin side, which means thereafter you need to be careful, and you might not be able to turn the bottom as much as you'd like. Now, folding the top in is easier if, at the start, you simply collar the top section in, even if it creates a curved shape. Doing this is more forgiving to the shape of the pot, as opposed to immediately trying to throw a sharp right angle like these will have towards the end. So I start by creating a curved shape at the top, and then I throw it inward, holding my fingers on my left hand underneath the wall to support it, and to prevent it from falling in more than I'd like. You'll also notice that doing this causes the outer wall to bow outward, but this is something I tend not to fix until towards the end of the process, as pressing this bump in causes the sloping walls to drop. But I'll show you that in a moment. First, I'm going to slice away some clay from the opening to make it a touch wider. And now, if you watch the black hole in the middle as I press from the rib on the outside, you'll see that I can make it drop down as I apply pressure on the exterior shape. I'll also coax it down by pressing it from above, but always with one finger underneath to support it. That's the third vase thrown, with the shape that's slightly bellied towards the bottom, but I'll be able to trim and fix that at the leather hard stage. For now, all that matters is that proportionally it matches the others, which I think it does. There's a nice gradual step between them. Let's just hope I can get the smallest version and the £5 vase to match. I'll start with the smaller version, which I'm going to throw from half a pound of clay, which is 226 grams. This is perhaps the easiest size to throw. You just have to make sure you remove all the water from inside these before you enclose the top. Otherwise it can be practically impossible to remove it, and if you have left a ton of water inside, it could eat through the base of your pot overnight, as the vase is left to turn leather hard. This lump of clay really is quite firm, so I'm going to dry centre it quickly, which should make centering hereafter easier. And really the exact same rules apply for this lump of clay as compared to all the others. It's centered, and with large lumps I sometimes scrape the outer wall just to make sure it's spinning true. I then open it up with my finger and thumb, filling the hole with a bit of water to lubricate it as I push my digits down, as inevitably, beneath these fingers it combines with the clay and makes slip, which due to all the friction quickly dries out, and it's when your hands are dry on the lump of clay you can begin to pull it off center, as your hands will stick to the clay or the clay will stick to your hands. And really, what we want at this stage is for the clay to be wet enough that it simply flows through your hands without anything sticking. For my first pull, I'm going to compress the outside with my palm, in much the same way that using a sponge helps to enlarge the surface area I apply pressure with. For a bigger lump of clay like this, for the first pull, I'll use my palm to do the exact same thing. And then I'll switch back to using a sponge on the outside to lift the clay up with, pressing in and pulling up in a very slow rate. This is not a process you want to rush, as when working with a larger expanse of clay, you need the entirety of that portion of wall to pass through your squeezed hands before you move them up, as otherwise you just create very prominent throwing rings and an uneven wall, which will then become harder and harder to lift up consistently in the following pulls. Once the cylinder is tall enough, I sponge out all the excess water from the inside. The slip gets scraped off the majority of the walls, and then the very top is collared in to create a much smaller opening. The idea of which being that a small opening will help keep any stem or branch or flower placed inside upright, whereas with a wider opening, whatever's placed in can fall to one side. At this point, there's a lot of back and forth. The slip gets scraped off, I do a bit more throwing, I do some refining, and then this uppermost flat section is gradually guided downward. For the second time, I accidentally made the opening a bit too small, but it's an easy fix with a sharp potter's needle. But at least it gives you a good idea of how thick the walls are here. And with that, that's the final one of these finished. The tallest in the group that should hopefully match the progression of the last. All of this, by the way, has been done completely by eye. I haven't used a ruler or a throwing gauge. Instead, it's just the weights of clay designated by the golden ratio that's led to this sequence of shapes. Not bad. I think the last one is perhaps slightly too narrow and a touch too tall, but I'll be trimming all of these at the leather hard stage, so I will be able to make some subtle changes. But if you are a potter and you're practicing, you should definitely give this a go. This ratio works no matter the shape of the pot you're making, be it bowls, vases, teapots or inkwells. As long as you can get enough out of each lump of clay, this clear, quite beautiful progression should be possible. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch, and as always, I'll see you next time.